Today, we have two amazing speakers who are joining us for our final session. Our first hour, we will hear from Samantha Mack, who is a good colleague and friend of mine who is a co-chair of the Arctic Youth Network and is a scholar in Indigenous languages and policies. She's a professor at the University of Alaska. She is a superstar scholar, and I will send out some of her writing after this session. And she is Alaska's first Rhodes Scholar, I think, if that is correct. I am going to hand my virtual mic over to Sam so that she can introduce herself a bit better than I have introduced her, and take it away on her presentation. As a reminder, we'll be using our chat. If you have any questions for Sam throughout her presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat box and I'll be monitoring that throughout. We'll have plenty of time for a robust discussion before our second speaker joins us in our second hour. And with that, I am going to hand my virtual mic over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Victoria. It's really wonderful to be here with you all. I do have to apologize. I was meant to be in another space for this presentation with a multiple screen setup. So I'm kind of making do with what I have here. But and also, I am the first Alaska Native Rhodes Scholar, not the first Alaskan Rhodes Scholar. I think many people might be a little offended if I let that one slide. But Ang Tala Unanga Samantha Mack Asachtakuk Agdago Ilagan Angyachtakuk. Hello, my name is Samantha Mack. I'm Unanga from the Agdago tribe of King Cove, Alaska. I will share my screen here and start my presentation. If I can figure out how to do that. Start share. Oh, I don't actually know how to share a screen, Victoria.
You should see on the bottom of your screen a share screen.
Gotcha. Okay, fantastic. Can everybody see this okay? Awesome. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you, well, first I'll give you a little bit of background, but then I'm going to be talking to you specifically about language access and Alaska Native voter enfranchisement. So first of all, again, Sam Mack, I have a background. I did my undergrad in political science, English literature, and Alaska Native Studies from the University of Alaska Anchorage, from the State University up here. Although most of my undergraduate experience was focused on Arctic policy, I wrote my honors thesis on semiotics and a famous Old English poem called The Battle of Malden. After that, I did my first master's degree in English literature at the university as well, where I wrote my thesis on survivance and Alaska Native displacement narratives. And I analyzed survivor records from the Unangach internment camps in Southeast Alaska, where the US government forcibly relocated several hundred Unanga civilians from their homes in the Aleutian Islands during World War II and placed them into some of the worst kept internment camps on American soil. And after that, in 2018, I went to Oxford to do my MPhil in political theory, where I wrote my dissertation on survivance in the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, sort of looking at it through a frame of like critical settler colonial theory. And then I came back to Alaska and kind of immediately hopped into this language access role. And as Victoria said, I also teach Alaska Native literatures at the University of Alaska up here. This presentation, like I said, is going to be more specifically focused on language access, but if any of you have any questions or want to have a conversation of anything else I've ever worked on or just something that you're interested in, you can reach out to me on my LinkedIn, which I've located below. So with that, today, first I'm going to give you a little bit of background and context in regards to United States voting law and what rights Alaska Native voters have in terms of language. And then I'll end with a discussion of kind of how this voting rights access impacts Indigenous language and cultural preservation. So first, what are the rights of Alaska Native voters with limited English proficiency? And that's a technical term. And so I might say limited English proficiency or just LEP moving forward. But the foundation of many of the voting rights established in the United States is, of course, the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act specifies the contexts under which voters are eligible for state-funded, state-provided assistance to allow them to ostensibly equitably participate in the voting process. And so one of the categories of assistance that states are required to provide is language assistance. So if you belong to a language minority as it is defined under the VRA and you speak and or read English with a limited proficiency, you then in some cases qualify for language assistance. So the definition of language minority under the Voter Rights Act is very, very particular. It is, quote, Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native, or Spanish languages, end quote. So that does not, notably does not include many language groups, including Slavic languages, including most of the Indo-Iranian language family. The reasoning behind this is a bit dubious, can probably be chalked up to some like casual codified racism. There's a lot written about that though, so it would be pretty easy to find. But one of the most important parts of the Voter Rights Act for our purposes today is Section 203, which requires that any covered jurisdictions provide, quote, any registration or voting notices, forms, instructions, assistance, or other materials or information relating to the electoral process, including ballots, in both English and whatever the covered language is. And Section 203 also establishes a statistical benchmark of either 5% of voting age citizens or more than 10,000 voting age citizens. So if that percentage or number are limited English proficient within a particular census area, it then triggers language assistance for those minority languages in that specific census area. Section 203 also establishes the historically unwritten rule, which states that languages that have been historically unwritten are only, states are only required to provide oral language assistance for those languages, or for voters who speak those languages, as opposed to written and oral assistance, which applies across the board for the rest of the historically written languages. The next relevant section is Section 2, which is really your traditional anti-discrimination model. It prohibits policies that result in the denial or dilution of a right to vote. This applies nationwide, not specifically to census areas, and is not bound to any of the statistical triggers I talked about in Section 203. What it does require, though, is a court determination of intentional discrimination or of, or a determination of discriminatory effects as a result of a state's practices. So Section 2 can be employed for languages outside of what the VRA has defined as the approved language minorities. And so oftentimes you'll see this used by plaintiffs who have sued specific areas to have assistance in their languages required. And this has occurred in a lot of places throughout the United States. And then we have Section 208, which states that folks who require assistance to vote for reasons of blindness, disability, or inability to read or write may be given assistance by the person of the voter's choice. And so this has been used a lot for Alaska Native voters in order to bring in a person of their choosing to help them read through the ballot and things like that, especially historically, which I'll talk about in a little bit, when translators have not been available to voters. And so this brings us to the Nick v. Bethel court case of 2010 in Alaska. And so in the Nick v. Bethel case, which I'll probably just call it the Nick case from here on out, It is especially important for our purposes because it changed the interpretation of the historically unwritten language rule of Section 203 of the VRA. And so, like I said, per 203, historically unwritten languages are only required oral assistance and not written assistance. But through the Nick case, in 2007, a federal district court interpreted the historically unwritten exemption for the very first time. And it actually decided that although the Yupik language is indeed historically unwritten in the traditional writing system sort of way, it determined that written translation of English election materials needed to be prepared in addition to the oral translations that had already been provided to ensure that the translated materials would actually be serving the voters in the ways that they were designed to serve them. And so with this, it's important to understand that many of the LEP, limited English proficiency voters across Alaska, specifically the ones who require assistance in Alaska Native languages, either one, simply don't have access to internet or to modern technological devices like smartphones or even email in a lot of cases, let alone like personal laptops. And sometimes these LEP voters may only speak their language and they don't have the ability to read or write in their language, so they only are able to use oral assistance. And so this becomes really challenging and complicated when you only have oral assistance available or when you only have written assistance available to a specific area. And it also makes you kind of question, how do we ensure that these voters are actually having equitable access to these materials in order to allow them, reasonable participation in the voting process, one of the most important processes of being a citizen of a democratic nation. So the Division of Elections, after this court case, started working on more written and oral PSAs to be disseminated via VHF radio across rural Alaska, in addition to creating glossaries and things like that. But was that enough? So that brings us to the Toyakuk settlement, the Toyakuk lawsuit, which also gives us a very loud no in answer to the question, is that enough? So the Toyakuk lawsuit, actually, I can go back here for a second. So the Toyakuk lawsuit pertained to only 3 of the covered 203 jurisdictions in Alaska. And basically in the Toyakuk lawsuit, the Native American Rights Fund, NARF, acting for plaintiffs, Mike Toyakuk and others, and other Yupik speaking, specifically elders in the Bethel census area, filed a lawsuit in 2014 claiming that the state of Alaska Division of Elections was intentionally discriminating against Alaska Native voters by providing inadequate language assistance. They said that they violated the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution and that the state's language assistance just failed to meet any of the requirements provided by Section 203. And so in particular, they stated that the state did not account for any of the dialectical differences across the Yupik communities or Gwich'in communities, which if you've ever been to rural Alaska can be very, very stark differences. And it also alleged that the division's Gwich'in assistance was effectively non-existent. And so NARF and the DOE, Division of Elections, eventually reached a settlement that created the language assistance program that I now manage. And so what the Toyakuk settlement did, sort of the really big things that it did, is it established a sort of best practices model for translation panels for Alaska Native languages. And so if you've ever worked with translators, especially for legal materials or for state-based contracts, for languages like Spanish and Tagalog and things, you will be paying translators per word, is sort of the traditional model. But that we found did not adequately compensate Alaska Native language speakers for their translation expertise. And so instead we sort of established a base of $70 to $50 per hour of translation work. And this is just because the linguistic and grammatical differences between most Alaska Native languages and the English language in particular are so different that the word-to-word model simply just really wasn't useful. It wasn't helpful at all. Additionally, the translation panel model was something new because oftentimes when you contract with a translator, it'll be one person working in an office or one person working freelance, for example, and you'll just be paying them their rate, and it'll be that one single individual who has established certificates in proficiency for translating in their language. And for Alaska Native languages, that kind of certificate model doesn't exist. The Alaska Native Languages Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks is working on creating a certificate model for the university to sort of give translators and speakers teaching certificates, but that doesn't exist yet. And so we had to kind of think, how can we compensate for that fact in a way that still accommodates the difficulties of translation. And so minimum 2 translators is what we have right now, minimum 2 translators working in tandem on a specific document to sort of back and forth check each other's work at a constant rate throughout the translation process, which does add quite a bit of time to the translation process. But because this next bullet point, the creation of new words, because that is such an integral part of what our translators do with the division of elections, it becomes especially important. And so with the creation of new words, we have things like the Electoral College, a concept that simply has never existed in any of the Yupik languages, Inupiaq languages, Gwich'in, any of the Alaska Native languages before. And now we're having to figure out what is, a reasonable, what is something that is related that we could sort of use to describe what the Electoral College is. Another example is mobile app. How do we translate mobile app into these Alaska Native languages when in many cases, some of them still don't have words for like cell phone or mobile in the first place. And so this kind of a thing is where we bring an entire panel together to sort of conference on what this new word will be. And so in this case, we would have experts from several different regions and several different Yupik dialects come together and like actually get down to the nitty-gritty and discuss what they think this word would be. And sometimes you have a case where most of the language experts are Alaska Native elders, and they might think something different from Alaska Native youth. And so you also have to consider who are the voters who are actually using these materials and what language style, what language practice would actually be most useful for them. And so it's a really interesting, really complicated process that is really quite something to see. The next important part of the Toyakuk settlement was that it established bilingual outreach workers for all of our rural communities that are a part of the settlement. And so these outreach workers are required to have like meetings with community members to post posters and share PSAs over the VHF and things like that, just to kind of share what's going on with the division and elections updates and things like that. And then the biggest thing is the official election pamphlet. And a lot of different states do these OEPs in whatever capacity, but the state of Alaska produced them in only English, Spanish, and Tagalog until quite recently. And as of the Toyakuk settlement, we now produce them in 8 different languages. There's General Central Yupik, Norton Sound Kotlik Yupik, Hooper Bay Yupik, Chivak Chupik, Nunavak Chupik, Yukon Yupik, Bristol Bay Yupik, and Gwich'in. And so this is one of those cases where our translators work together in panels to translate over 100 pages of content in order to disseminate them to voters. So how is all of this even related to language revitalization? So the way I see it, and the way that most people who do work in language access and language preservation and cultural preservation and revitalization, the way that most of us see it is that language is, in fact, very intrinsically related to culture. It's very intrinsically related to a people, to, maintaining a way of life. And I don't know if anybody has philosophy backgrounds or anything like that, but for me in particular, I think about it in terms of Indigenous ontologies. So in terms of how Indigenous people exist in the world, view the world around them, and how, ways of knowing and how basic things operate. And so for most Indigenous communities, historically, it very much has been that everything is intrinsically related, whether or not it is conceived of as like alive in the Western, Christian sense. And so with that, the air around us is alive, the rocks and the trees are alive. Everything has an essence to it, and that includes language. And so oftentimes, I think the Sapir-Whorf theory is kind of the equivalent of that in a lot of ways. But, in many ways, this is just kind of related to how people perceive the world and how Indigenous people in particular relate to one another. And so when you have a situation that you have in Alaska with over 220 languages, Alaska Native languages spoken, many of those are, the languages are dying at a really sort of scary rate. The role that the Division of Elections then plays in creating, these online glossaries, oral glossaries, written glossaries, and kind of creating new words in these languages to allow them to continue on into the 21st century becomes really important. And also just the resources being used as a teaching tool for students not affiliated with the Division of Elections in any capacity also becomes really important. Yeah, that's it. I think I had a snappy ending, but it was on my other computer, so I have to apologize for that. But yeah, I'll turn it over to Victoria to facilitate any questions.
Yeah, well, I think that was a very meaningful ending, if not a snappy ending. So if everyone could join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you, Sam, for a fantastic presentation, one that had so much information in it. I know I was taking a lot of notes. I'm sure I was not the only one. I see Scout also shaking her head. So we are going to move to the question and answer section section of our session. As a reminder, if you have questions for Sam, you can either raise your hand or you can put your question in the chat box so that I can ask if you'd like to come on. But let's get started with Susanna, if you would like to come on and ask your question first.
Great. Thank you very much, Victoria. And thank you very much, Sam. Also, as somebody who was at Oxford and involved in some similar language studies, but in a different part of the Arctic, I'm really appreciative of what you're doing. Also, in the linguistics and anthropology departments there. But one thing that I'm interested in this is just my own interest, because I'm also, I have my master's in linguistics and sort of looking at Indigenous language and not in elections and voting, but in other political avenues. But I also do some work nationally on voting access and looking at languages with voting. So I'm just wondering, voting and elections, ballots, et cetera, and having, but what about greater sort of civic engagement where, what's possibly what's on the ballot? How is that looking at cultural survival or cultural support? How do we get sort of the politics of maybe what is, I guess, yeah, what is, I'm sorry, I'm a mess at the moment. What is on the ballot? How do we align that and support cultural survival beyond language and having language as one tool, but sort of the meat behind it with what people are voting on and how is that working and how is that outplaying in the community? So if that makes any sense. And also, I'm going to follow up with you later, but thank you so much for being here.
Let me repeat the question back to you to make sure that I've got it. So you're asking sort of how do we maybe educate or reach voters where they're at in terms of what's on the ballot to make sure that they have full cultural understanding of the kinds of things that are going on.
And sort of what's on the ballot is not always focused on Indigenous culture.
Yes.
And can be at odds, at least in my experience when I was doing a lot of this in Scandinavia. So how do we work with language, with communities to rectify, not necessarily to rectify that, but to support, community survival beyond just language, using the ballot, using civic engagement.
Yes, that is such a great question and such an important consideration, I think. And I can only speak to Alaska in particular, but really one of the things that the state here has struggled with is with funding. Paying translators is very expensive, and especially when you have a translation panel model, it becomes very unsustainable to pay thousands and thousands of dollars to translate materials for 50, 75, 100 people, which sometimes is all that exists in terms of speakers for a particular language. Now, personally, I believe that that is very worthwhile and still something that we absolutely should be doing. Unfortunately, not everybody always agrees with that stance. And when you exist in a state that is in practice, an extractive economy, an oil-based economy, and that is very much changing now. Funding streams are depleting. The division might not be getting all of the funding that it could be getting, and you have other changes being put into play. And so sometimes things just kind of fall through some very large cracks. And that's the reality of the situation. So in terms of that, I will say that I think the best work is not being done by the state. In a lot of cases, the best work is being done by local community organizations, by tribes themselves, by people working on the ground. And so that's something that the division hasn't done historically, is been able to actually reach individuals in these communities very well. And so something that I'm really trying to do moving forward is to partner with these organizations who have a trusting relationship with these communities, because also you have to think about the very nefarious role the state has played historically with these Indigenous communities, and particularly in terms of language. When the state has enforced English-only practices for hundreds of years, there's still a lot of hurt there. There's still a lot of mistrust and a lot of bad feelings, to be really frank. And so you also have the case of the fact that some people in these communities just don't want to work with you. They just don't want to, be a part of this, what can be perceived as extractive relationship with state actors. And so a big part of my job is to try to think about how I can reestablish trust with these communities, which is always an ongoing project, because the feelings that these people have are very valid and very legitimate. And so, we kind of have to think about what communities what organizations are doing this good work, and model what we do after what they're doing, and sort of ask them if they're willing to help us in that, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel if people are already doing it and already having successful outreach. And that can be about ballot measure issues, or just things on the ballot, or just things going on in the state in general. There's a lot of community outreach that happens by people not affiliated with the state government in any capacity. And I think that's really where the strength of all of this comes from. I think that answered your question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you for deciphering my questions. So, as much better than I could articulate it, and appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question from Griffith, who says, thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask to what degree you see standardization across dialects and languages as a result of translating and interacting with settler cultures. Do you see a move towards standard Gwich'in as an example?
I mean, yes and no. And thank you for that question. Yes and no. I think the project of doing things like this and creating a glossary is to sort of create a standardization, or at least a consistent terminology across communities, so that when you have things like a new word for the Electoral College, it is understood by multiple people. It is understood by multiple communities, and not just the communities from which our particular translators came from. That being said, though, the dialectical differences are astounding, and the differences even like 10 miles downriver between communities who speak the same dialect are astounding. And so it's something that you really have to be critical of. And it's also why we have all of our translators come from different communities and speak different dialects, so that you can try to establish this, like cross-community cultural, I don't like the word standardization, but something like that between them. I didn't really answer your question. I apologize, but yeah, I think that's something for us to be thinking about pretty continuously as we move forward. Is that the ultimate project? Is it to have this sort of standardization across languages? I don't personally maybe think that should be the case. It's not really up to us, an outside entity, to determine the future of those languages, other than, sharing in the efforts of preservation and revitalization. Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you.
Yeah, and Griffith might come back with a second question that I will read once I get it. But in the meantime, Demetrius, do you want to come on and ask your question next?
Yes, thank you very much, Samantha, for presentation. And yeah, basically basically the discussion over the translation and of the different dialects reminded me of research I was doing now on like a project. It's on the other end basically of the world. It's like, it was for South Africa, but it was again a discussion over stakeholder involvement for a project that energy and metallurgical, and about the translation during the stakeholder involvement, because there were different communities with different dialects and the quality of it. And this is what I was wondering now, in similar projects, for example, in Alaska, what is the process, for example, for the stakeholder involvement? Do they have these translations? Because you mentioned that they can be quite costly or more time consuming. So how do basically the companies or the state there tackle this issue? Do they do them properly? Does it seem that they don't put a lot of effort or not at all for some of the communities? And what are maybe the hurdles, the impediments, and maybe what are the complaints of the communities there over these issues?
I was just writing down some notes for your question. That's a really fantastic question, and again, something really important to kind of think about as anybody who works in translation, I think would say. So the process for stakeholder involvement, because it is for a statewide agency, I think is pretty basic in our case, and really it's what communities qualify for Section 203 assistance, and if they don't qualify for Section 203 assistance, the state is not legally mandated, is not legally required to provide translation assistance for those languages and for those communities. As an election official, I'm not really allowed to, give too much personal opinion on the matter, but that's the matter of fact situation that we're dealing with right now. That in addition to the funding issue that I kind of already talked about and that you touched upon, means that it's also not always financially feasible to pursue translation for some of these other languages that maybe we would otherwise really want to pursue, but might not fall under Section 203 jurisdiction. That being said, though, so with the Toyakuk settlement, there is a very long laundry list of things that the state is required to produce. The ones that I listed are only a small facet of those, the main one being the OEP, like I said, but also like the bilingual outreach workers, there's PSAs, there's a bunch of website resources, and just like a really long laundry list. And so that is where sort of the really big cost comes in to play, is in developing all of these resources and standardizing, again, there's that word, standardizing, maintaining them up to, making sure that they're correct and checking in with the translators every year, every couple of years, to make sure that the things that we have are still, being used and are still relevant. And so while we may not do those for all languages, the division provides assistance for 15 to 17 languages on any given year. Most of those are Alaska Native languages. And so while we might not be, translating the entire OEP, the entire official election pamphlet, into all of those languages. We are providing sample ballots in all of those languages. We are providing, PSAs, audio and written PSAs to communities who have speakers of those languages so that they can, announce them over the VHF or post up the written PSA in their post office or grocery store or something like that. And of course, COVID has created astronomical boundaries to a lot of these things. And so the challenges present in the last year have really changed the way that we think about how a lot of this is done. But in terms of stakeholders and stakeholder access, that's kind of what has been the case. And that's also, I guess, kind of touches on the hurdles, impediments, and complaints. But so right now, for example, in addition, the Toyakuk settlement officially ended on December 31st, 2020. And so right now, the state of Alaska is in the process of renegotiating that settlement and sort of determining what aspects of it are going to continue forward into the future in terms of like federal mandates, in terms of legal requirements, and what aspects the state is going to continue to do regardless. A big reason why I'm really happy and grateful to be in my role right now is because I'm trying to, create a process whereby all of the assistance that we provide is continued on into the future, sort of regardless of the legal status of the settlement, because people still do have complaints, because people still, don't have as much access to these materials as they should, as they could. And a lot of that is just because it very much has been the state going at it alone and not really thinking about how to partner with community organizations who are doing a lot of this work in terms of voter outreach, in terms of, just actually speaking with people, speaking with individuals. And so I think being able to cross that bridge is going to be really important to overcoming these hurdles going forward into the future. That was a really great question. Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you for answering. Yeah, that was a really good answer and thorough. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask Susanna if you would like to come back on and ask your follow-up question to Griffith's question, and then we have another follow-up question from Griffith's question.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned a little bit about this in your last answer, so I won't get into it, but I was also like, you're mentioning that there's support for the 8 languages now, and you just mentioned support for several more. And to talk about language versus dialect and how people who speak the same language or dialect can still have quite different subdialects. And to what degree is this prioritization of language, whether it's intentional to some degree because you're choosing which languages to support and which languages effectively not to support as a result. Mm-hmm. Is that how are you seeing results in different communities, whether people are not either seeing their language or not seeing their language or dialect, knowing that there's a very fuzzy line in some cases between language and dialect, and certainly when it comes to identity, not just in terms of understanding. What is the effect on the community? And I know you've mentioned about some of the implications about finances and certainly the issues with translators and maybe not having everybody being able to access all materials in their first language. But what are the impacts on the community when you have this prioritization? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I'll give a real life example, actually, and this was before I joined the division. This was a few years ago. I think in 2018, there was a ballot measure proposed that was sort of directly impacting access to salmon. And I think it was in particular regarding the Bristol Bay fishery. And so, you have the Yupik speaking communities in that sort of basin of Alaska that are, going to see immediate impacts whichever way, yes or no, that ballot measure got decided, which really created this driving need to have this particular ballot measure and the pro and con statements, the neutral statement, the statement of costs translated into as many dialects as possible, because these people were literally going, like it could have the potential to change their day-to-day lives and their economies and everything. And so I think, again, before I got here, so I don't have all of the nitty-gritty details, but I think basically, in addition to the basic to the basic dialects that were mandated to provide assistance in through the Toyakuk settlement, there were 2 additional dialects that the division pursued translation of materials in across the Yupik Basin, or the Yupik speaking area of Alaska. And so that was Upper Nishigak Yupik, and I'm spacing the other one, but basically, because this dialect was dissimilar enough to General Central Yupik, which would be the dialect that would go to these communities in any other given year, but because this dialect was so dissimilar, it would have been a very big disservice to these communities if they did not have these actual materials present in their dialect. And so that was kind of what would happen. What happened. That has not happened in subsequent years. And a lot of this comes down to, again, the availability of the speakers, and do they have access to laptop and email in a year of COVID, where you can't exactly meet with Alaska Native elders in person around the state. And so that's another kind of thing that we've had to think about, is what kind of access can we provide? What kind of access do these folks even, are able to get in terms of the content for translation? And so I don't necessarily have a firm answer for you in terms of what the effects on the communities are. I think that's an ongoing conversation. I think that in this case, more is more. More translated materials is more, better, greater effects for these communities. I don't know that that is the case in practice. I would like it to be, but we're all doing our best.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Another follow-up from Griffith, who wants to ask also about the parallels you see between language as an entry barrier in the democratic process and language as an entry barrier into the formal market economy. And if that is a barrier, what structures, support are in place to address this?
This is in the chat, I'm assuming, so.
Yeah, it's up
okay.
A little bit.
Okay. So the thing about talking about entry into formal market, formal economy in Alaska, is that Alaska is in a very unique position in that colonization didn't happen all that long ago. And so there are a lot of places in Alaska where formal market economy doesn't necessarily exist in the way that a lot of people think it might or would expect it to. Gosh, this is a really nuanced question. And you also have to think about the fact that because colonization didn't begin all of that long ago, the insertion of a Western market economy, which is not a real thing, but I think you might understand what I say when I say like Western, the traditional market economy, capitalist market economy. When the insertion of a capitalist economy sort of became the standard, the norm, many of our rural communities were not really equipped to participate in an equitable way. And as a result, we have massive poverty across rural Alaska. And that's not like a one-to-one cause and effect kind of a thing. There's a lot of stuff that goes on, a lot of stuff that contributes to that. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that language access is, I think, one very, very, very small part of the barrier, one very small part of why maybe entry into a formal or market economy might be difficult. I don't know that it is a particularly large part, but it's just one very small part, because there are just so many other things going on that make that transition a difficult transition. I don't know that it's a transition that many people necessarily want to make. Capitalism isn't the be all end all for a lot of folks. So for the first part of that question, though, I think I can answer a bit better. language as an entry barrier in the democratic process. I think that language can be a very big barrier to enter into the democratic process, and particularly into voting. Right now, especially, we have the availability of translated sample ballots, but to what degree are the sample ballots, one-to-one with the actual ballots? You might write your answers on the ballot and stuff, and that's one thing, but I think having the actual ballot in the language available for you on a voting machine or voting tablet or whatever the mechanism is, I think would be a much better resource. It's not something that we're able to do all across rural Alaska right now, simply because of availability of resources. And again, like the cost of these voting tablets is astronomical, and then transporting them back and forth out to every single rural community, every single election, and then back in to the hub to process is kind of crazy. But in terms of the barriers to both of those, I think that there are quite a lot of parallels that people don't necessarily think about. And again, it's about this, like, colonization is ongoing. It's not a one and done process. It's not over. It started long ago, and it is still ongoing, whatever various ways, intentionally or unintentionally. And I think that does impact access to voting, access to participation in the entire democratic process, and access to, traditional economic models in a very similar way.
Ooh, thank you. That was a very, I don't want to say difficult question, but like an all-consuming question of
there's a lot there.
Everything. Yeah.
I'm happy to chat with you more about this, Griffith, if you want to get in touch later as well.
Yeah, that is what these sessions are all about, to foster more discussion. We have another question from Sierra, who I'm going to ask to come on and ask your question.
Hi, Samantha. What are your thoughts on the connections among linguistic and cultural revitalization? There are differences from their original cultures, so due to time and contact with other cultures, and how these relate to perceived authenticity or lack thereof. For instance, you mentioned translating Western political terms in mobile apps.
That's a really interesting question. And I think my answer might differ from somebody else's, from many other people's, depending on who you ask. I don't think that original culture is a concept that necessarily we should be engaging with. I think it's kind of a false concept that, is created by a lot of that it, frankly, is perpetuated by colonizer mindsets. And by that, I mean, it's easy to say, it's easy to remove rights from Indigenous peoples if you can say, oh, look how removed they are from their original culture, look how different they are now. But, everybody is moving through history and time in the same exact way, and everybody interacts with different peoples in the same exact ways. And, Indigenous peoples were interacting and engaging with each other historically constantly. It was just that when colonizers arrived, that particular kind of interaction became very nefarious very quickly, and has had a very drastic, long-lasting impact, which we all know. So I think in terms of perceived inauthenticity, I don't know that in Alaska that is necessarily something that I, come up against or am faced with in my work in particular. I think that instead of this idea of perceived inauthenticity, I think it's more, youth and elders working together to establish shared understanding about whatever concepts we may be confronting. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. That's an interesting question. I would love to chat with you more about that, because I think there's really a lot behind that idea of original culture. And there's a lot of folks who have done some really great writing on it in terms of like a post-colonial context.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We had one more question from someone who will watch the recording of this, and she wanted to know where work happens in language revitalization across borders. This person says she doesn't see a lot of that happening within the Arctic Council and wonders where that work happens, or if it's not happening, where that work could happen.
I don't know that the Arctic Council is the space for that to happen, to be frank. I think that perhaps a platform where Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples have more than, have the ability to be voting participants and inflect maybe more change on that, on a voting body than they might in the Arctic Council. I think maybe a situation like that might be great. I think of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, for example, that crosses many international boundaries. And I know that there's been some interesting work going on there in terms of language. I don't have any specifics. I would have to do a bit more research. But I think in terms of language revitalization, it can be challenging when you think about transnational work, simply because of, again, this the massive, insane amount of dialectical differences that we encounter. Like I said, like 5 miles, 10 miles downriver, let alone, 1,000 miles across a border. And I know the same can be said in Canada as well with the language differences. And so that's a really interesting question. I'd have to think about that some more, but I think that international bodies have great potential to participate in the process of cultural revitalization and language revitalization in particular. I think that, a great way for that to happen is for them to provide some funding and some structural support for this ongoing project. But like I said before, I don't think that this is a project that should be spearheaded by folks who are not working in the language, in the specific language already. I think that it is a project that can be supported by folks who are working outside of that language. But I think it should be led by people who are, speakers of those languages, who understand the nuance and the cultural difference and the intricacies within and around their own individual languages. I think otherwise you have massive potential for outside influence in not necessarily the best sort of ways. That's an interesting question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, a lot of interesting questions, not that I am surprised from our participants because they are all really incredible thinkers in this group. But I think something to think more about as a group and maybe something to discuss after our session today, because what Sam just said, I don't think is the first time we have heard this discussion about the difference between international organizations or Western institutions supporting rather than leading. We remember Victoria's presentation a few weeks ago on Indigenous conservation, and even last week with public health in Northern Russia in Indigenous communities. So I think a lot of similar themes we've heard throughout the past few weeks, and maybe something to think and even consider writing about in your briefers on what you've learned here. But I see we are just at our hour. So I want to again invite everyone to join me in giving a huge and thunderous virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, Sam, for being so generous with your time, your expertise, your experience today. I am so appreciative that you joined us. And I am sure everyone else on this Zoom, even if you can't hear them, is also incredibly appreciative.
Yeah, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate the thoughtful questions and engagement. This was really spectacular.
Ooh, thank you, Sam. All right, so we are now going to transition to our second speaker. So again, this is our finale, our final speaker in our synchronized sessions every Tuesday. And I think this is a great final speaker that hopefully will touch on many things that we have spoken to over the past 6 weeks. And it is my honor to bring on Dr. Beth Ferris, who is also a good friend and colleague. She is one of my co-principal investigators of the National Science Foundation Research Coordination Network that is running this school, and is also one of my colleagues at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. I will ask you, Beth, if you want to give a brief overview of who you are, because you give such a wonderful and I think narrative vision of your long career in international migration. And then we will hear a great presentation on climate displacement, migration, and relocation. And we will have time afterwards for a robust discussion. So please get those questions ready. As a reminder, similar to every other session, if you have questions, you can put those in the chat as Beth is presenting, and I'll go ahead and pull those. Or if you have questions as we're speaking during the discussion, you can always raise your hand by going to the participants icon and checking that raised hand box. All right, but for now, I am going to hand over my virtual mic to you, Beth, to take it away.
Hey, and I just caught your virtual mic. Well, hello, everybody. It's great to be with you. I looked over your program and I'm just amazed at all the different topics you've managed to cover in these past weeks. I mean, it looks like a very comprehensive and full approach, and I hope you've come to appreciate the multidisciplinary nature of understanding what's happening in the Arctic. So as Victoria said, my name is Beth Ferris. I'm a professor at Georgetown, but I spent most of my career working in the humanitarian field, particularly with refugees and displaced people. I started out working with people displaced by conflict. I lived and worked in Geneva for many years and traveled everywhere. And then starting in about 2004, 2005 with the Indian Ocean tsunami, really began to see parallels between the way people who were displaced by disasters and eventually climate and those who were displaced by conflict, had a lot in common. Until 2004, there had been an assumption in the humanitarian world that people displaced by conflict faced serious human rights and protection issues, but that people displaced by disasters, well, they were basically okay. It was just all about logistics, getting water and food and medical care. And there really wasn't much emphasis on human rights and protection of people who were forced to move for disaster reasons. The more we looked into it, the more we found that wasn't true. We found people displaced by Hurricane Katrina faced enormous range of human rights violations in the United States, something that's duplicated in many countries, whether it's Mozambique or Philippines or Japan, et cetera. And so really brought some of my experience in working on protection human rights into this field of climate displacement. And it was particularly in working on issues around displacement caused by disasters in the Pacific Islands, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that really became aware of the gravity of climate change and how that was increasingly forcing people to move. Today, estimates of the number of people who will be forced to move because of climate change are all over the map. Different scientists use different models to predict the number of people. Some climate scientists, I think, use a rather simplistic notion that everybody living within a certain range of the coast will be forced to move if sea level rises by X amount. From a migration perspective, we know that movement of people is always complicated. It always varies, depending on how many resources you have and your social networks and your particular situation. I have two sisters who live in South Texas, for example, that evacuated 3 times last summer because of hurricanes. And one of my sisters said, I've had it, I'm out of here. And she moved. And my other sister said, well, I can't leave my job and my husband. And, you know, there were different personal circumstances, even though the threat, the risk of the disaster was pretty much the same for the two of them. So we see this even much more complicated in looking at the global scale. So I'm going to talk about one particular form of climate migration, and that's called planned relocations, which is a particular concern in the Arctic as more and more communities are facing the reality that their habitats are becoming uninhabitable and would rather move with their community than to make the trek on their own. So I'm going to talk primarily from a global perspective, and we can draw the connections with the Arctic as we discuss. But just to give you a sense of some of the thinking that's going on in the international community, at least, on this issue of planned relocations. This photo to begin, this is a picture of Kivalina in Alaska. And you can see, you can just predict, you know, this area is going to soon become uninhabitable simply because of increasing sea level rise, destruction of Arctic ice, increasing intensity of storms, and so forth. On the right is a photo of a place called Ile Jean Charles in Louisiana, which is one of the few cases in the United States where we're beginning to have evidence of how this works or doesn't work. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the process used to develop some guidance. These are global guidelines on planned relocation, and report of a recent study that analyzed 308 cases of planned relocation, and then zero in on one specific case, Ile de Jean Charles. One of the things I hate about Zoom is I can't see your faces. So if you have a question as I'm going through this, please feel free to just jump in and start talking, and certainly I'll allow plenty of time for discussion at the end. Okay, so starting back in 2010, the Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, known as COP, COP met in Cancun in 2010 and adopted a climate change adaptation framework. This was the first time that the climate change authorities had seriously considered migration. And their final agreement was to invite everyone to enhance understanding, coordination, and cooperation with regard to climate change-induced displacement, implying people forced to move, migration, implying people who move with anticipation, who choose to move, and planned relocation. Well, even by 2010, there was quite a bit of attention, particularly to displacement, some to environmentally induced migration, but nobody really knew what planned relocation meant. And so as a result of a meeting that was originally convened by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and then later joined by a bunch of other international organizations, we began looking at different normative frameworks for refugees, international refugee law, human rights law, guidelines on internal displacement, migration law is kind of a hodgepodge of different instruments, and found very little guidance as to how do you relocate a whole community in a way that respects the rights of those who are being relocated or moved. Most of the experience on this came from development projects, particularly World Bank funded development projects where large numbers of people would be relocated in order to build, for example, a dam. And the World Bank had a whole set of guidelines for how this works. But you know, the results of this were actually pretty negative, you know, combing through evaluations of literally hundreds of these development-induced resettlement projects. There weren't very many good examples of areas where things had gone well and people were better off after they moved. In fact, usually they were worse off. And so, you know, a group of us got together and began thinking, you know, how could we develop some kind of guidelines to make this a less negative or even a positive experience? You know, the idea that we realized was that People with means will migrate as they see the handwriting on the wall. This is already happening around the world, is that people who have the possibility of migrating for work to another place in the country or even to another country will do so before things become disastrous. I remember years ago talking to a pastor from Kiribati in the Pacific who told me literally with tears running down his cheeks that there's no future for my children here in our country, our homeland, our culture. There's no future. We know that. And so we're sending our kids off to university in Australia, hoping that they can get an education there, find a job there, and settle there, because we know there's no possibility for them in the long term here. That's anticipatory migration. It doesn't count as a climate migrant. There is no such category. But in fact, people are already making those decisions when they perceive that they will be better off if they move elsewhere, just like my sister who moved from Galveston to San Antonio, Texas. Then there are people who will be displaced, particularly by sudden onset emergencies such as cyclones, storm surges, flooding, hurricanes, drought, slow onset. And they'll be displaced. Sometimes there's assistance for people who are displaced after an emergency. It's never enough. It never lasts long enough, but there'll be some assistance. But what about those who are left behind? Those who don't have the means to travel, those who, for various reasons, maybe because of age or disability, are unable to even think about moving, they're stuck. What Richard Black called trapped populations. So planned relocations is a way of addressing the needs of those who are trapped, who can't move on their own. It can be a way of reducing the risk of disasters and casualties, moving people out of harm's way before things get terrible. Or it can be a means of adapting to climate change in a more proactive sense. So working with colleagues from UNHCR, World Bank, IOM, Georgetown, Brookings, where I used to work, UN University, we held a whole series of expert meetings and meetings with governments and civil society of places where relocations had taken place, which led to the development of basic principles or guidance. But first we had to deal with this always tricky issue of jargon, of terms. People use many different terms to refer to this: relocations, planned relocations, preemptive relocations. Resettlement was the term used by the World Bank. The refugee folks said, no, resettlement just refers to refugees. It will be too confusing. Evacuations, a particular kind of relocation, always assumed to be temporary and reactive in nature. Coastal retreat and managed retreat are terms that are often used in the United States to refer to a process of moving people away from coasts where they are more vulnerable. So we came up with this guidance, first, setting out general principles, defining what planned relocation was, saying it isn't enough to just physically move people, but rather to give people the means to rebuild their lives. There are tons of cases of where governments have relocated populations from Harare, Zimbabwe, from Mogadishu, Somalia, and just move people out of the center of the city to the outskirts to, it's kind of an urban renewal thing. But when you dump people in another area and they aren't able to start or reestablish their community, we don't consider that a planned relocation. So planned relocations we looked at only in the context of natural hazards, not technological disasters, although I suspect there might be similar processes and needed when there's a major oil spill or a chemical explosion. Movement of people, not things. There are cases in the United States where communities have decided to relocate a public park, for example, or a building. But we're really focusing on movement of people and movement of communities rather than individuals. In the US and some other rich countries, buyouts are sometimes used as an alternative where the government will come into an area, such as parts of New Jersey that were affected by Hurricane Sandy, and will say to people living in flood zones, we will buy your house. We will give you market value pre-disaster for your house on the condition that you move out and move someplace safer. So people get the cash from their houses, they move on their own, and they can choose wherever they want to move. There's no effort to move the whole community or to reestablish a community. Planned relocations are assumed to be permanent or at least long-term. They're not temporary like evacuations. You don't expect people to move back after the storm surge goes down. And they're not spontaneous, but rather they're planned and coordinated. It's not just a group of people, a neighborhood deciding, well, it's time to move, let's pack up and find someplace else. So the guidance set out we analyzed as many international instruments and operational frameworks as we could find and developed some just overarching principles that would apply, we think, to just about every planned relocation. For example, planned relocation should be a measure of last resort. I mean, it should be after other adaptation and disaster risk reduction measures have been tried. It should be carried out within a rights-based framework that respects the rights of everybody, those who are moved, the community to which they're moving, and other people who are affected. I mean, sometimes, in New Zealand, for example, they relocated people after the Christchurch earthquake as a community in a very elaborate, consultative, basically a really good process. But there were people who fell just outside of the zone of being entitled to relocation assistance, who saw their property values diminish and faced all kinds of problems when the community moved on and they were left there. A basic principle is that a relocation should improve or at least restore their living standards. In other words, people should not be worse off when they're relocated because of the effects of climate change or other environmental disasters. And to uphold family unity, not separate families, to minimize adverse effects on others, etc. So these general guidance spelled out things like what should be included in a legal and policy framework. Very few governments, I think there are only 2 or 3 in the world, have developed guidelines or guidance or policies on planned relocations. Fiji and Vanuatu have both developed them. The United States has not. Indeed, in the United States, it's very difficult even to know who's in charge of planned relocations. Is it Housing and Urban Development or Department of the Interior or EPA or somebody else? It's just not clear. Another important essential principle is this participation of affected communities. In other words, the communities that are affected have a right to decide whether they need to move, to assess the evidence, to decide how it's going to happen, where they will go, and every aspect of the process. Too often governments implement planned relocation measures without these consultative processes. And as you might expect, the results are never as good as they could have been if there had been that participation. However, we heard from governments, different regions saying, well, those principles are all really nice, but they're very general and abstract. We need some more concrete guidance. What works? What are best practices? So we then compiled a toolbox that brought together best practices, and there really aren't that many best practices on planned relocations. Recognizing that, one size doesn't fit all. Experience of, say, Alaskan or Canadian Indigenous communities is very different from those in the Caribbean or in parts of Africa or in Norfolk, Virginia, where planned relocation may be needed. Instead of being prescriptive, as what international organizations usually do, and saying, governments should, governments must, we decided to compile a list of checklists and say, have you thought about this? As you're thinking about this, have you considered these 50 things that we've seen are important in the eventual success, however that's defined, of planned relocations. So we looked at in terms of a decision to undertake planned relocation, who decides, on the basis of what evidence? What if there's disagreement on the evidence, with some saying, oh, we don't need to move yet, and other scientists saying you got to move now? For how you develop a plan, how you implement a plan, how you deal with that tricky limbo period between knowing a community is going to move and their actual move. And how do you deal with that? Sometimes it could be years in between time where you continue to provide public services, for example, to these communities, and particularly in the longer term. So we looked at the legal framework, the needs and impacts of affected populations, information, consultation, participation of affected persons. And, you know, these terms are often used interchangeably, but they're very different. You know, government can come and say, oh, we consulted with this particular group because we organized a meeting and we explained our plans to them. You know, that's not really consultation, and it definitely isn't participation. So, you know, are there ways of ensuring that people actually participate? Land issues are always sensitive, you know, almost in every region, almost every context. Who owns the land? Who buys the land? What happens to the land after people have moved on? Particularly for Indigenous groups to whom there is a particular symbolic, cultural importance of land and ability to return home, even if you can't live there, to visit the land of your ancestors is very important. Studies in Latin America show that after people are moved off land to protect them, to get them out of danger, usually more people move into that vacated land, and people are poor and they move into that land. So it doesn't really solve the problem of protecting large numbers of people from a particular hazard. So just to give you a flavor of some of the types of questions, do the laws, you know, say who's responsible for which aspects of the issue, who has the authority to make decisions, the decision to initiate planned relocation? Has there been an environmental impact assessment of the impact of moving people to the new site? You know, have traditional and non-traditional community leaders participated in the process? In many settings, one of the difficulties is using traditional leaders often means just listening to the men speak. You know, how do you ensure that women also are able to participate without challenging traditional leadership structures? What are the mechanisms to carry out land acquisition? Some governments, like the United States, have policies of eminent domain. If it's judged in the greater public interest, land can be confiscated. Many countries don't have that. Even when it does exist, it's always difficult. You know, are there ways of monitoring what happens, including people who choose not to move? Can you compare, you know, how they fared after the community has moved on? Basically, it's complex. It doesn't have a great record. It's a last resort. I mean, there are some things you can do to enhance the chances for success, but you know, overall, this is new territories. I think it's likely we're going to see many more planned relocations in the future, given the impacts of climate change. There is really shockingly little research on some of these efforts. I attended a workshop with the Vietnamese government looking at one of their relocation schemes, and they'd relocated over 300,000 people from coastal areas to prevent them from experiences of recurrent flooding. One of the few surveys of people who'd been relocated in Vietnam found that people felt safer. They liked not having floods every year and liked not having to rebuild their homes and to evacuate. But they all felt, or most of them felt, much poorer, that the expense of relocating had really caused them to take on new debt. So they were safer, but economically their perception was that they were actually worse off than before the relocation. But there aren't many such studies. One, and I'll kind of close with this, was carried out earlier this year by a couple of colleagues, Erica Bauer at Stanford University and Sanjula in Geneva. And they went through all of the literature and found 308 documented cases of planned relocation. You know, they only worked in English, Spanish, and French, so there may be other cases out there. They found different models, from moving from one origin place to a single destination, to moving from various places to various destinations in these 308 cases. They found this happened in 60 countries. Over half of them were in Asia. Most of them were single origin community to single relocation site. They found that almost all of them were in multi-hazard contexts. It wasn't just that they were susceptible to flooding, but that there were, several different hazards that were acting, and found, virtually no one had policy guidance or could point to laws or programs. They dug deeper into 34 cases where they could get lots of information. And half of those people were already displaced before the relocation took place. The distance of relocation varied enormously, but relatively short distances. From 200 meters to the longest they found was 64 kilometers, a little less than 50 miles on the Ile de Jean Charles case. From 4 households were moved to 100 households were moved. They didn't find evidence of these massive relocations, such as in China or Vietnam or elsewhere. Almost all of them were rural to rural, not so much rural to urban or urban to urban. About half of them were initiated by the community. The community said, we have to move. Most of them had some mechanism for participation of affected communities. They found that the distinction between reactive and proactive were blurred. A lot of them, a lot of planned relocations occur after recurring sudden onset disasters. So in a way, it's to prevent future disasters, but also to respond to the reality of past ones. Louisiana is particularly impacted. I won't show this map of the impact of climate change on Louisiana, but the prospects for large-scale flooding throughout much of the state, certainly much of the southern part of the state, is enormous. And particularly the community of Ile Jean Charles, and I'll close with this. This is a photo, I think, of the mayor of Ile Jean Charles, and you can see, his house is up on stilts. In actuality, this was, there were 3 separate efforts to raise the house. First it was raised a certain level, and then that wasn't enough to prevent recurrent flooding. So it was raised again until now it's at a height of about 12 or 15 feet. It's expensive, very expensive to retrofit houses. This is the little community of Ile de Jean Charles. This is New Orleans. This whole area here is very prone to effects of climate change and flooding, sudden onset disasters like hurricanes. But it's complicated because of the impact of offshore or oil and gas exploration, which has definitely impacted the coastline and has led to subsidence or to actual sinking of the mainland. So this small community, now about 100 people total, was relocated to this site. The relocation is in process. It hasn't been completed. I'll share my PowerPoint with Victoria in case you want to see a 10-minute video of PBS that talks to members of this community about the decision to relocate. This was a case of basically 35 families who were moving 30 or 40 miles away. I mean, that sounds pretty manageable. They received a grant from Housing and Urban Development some years ago for $48 million to support the relocation. HUD said it did this to see if Ile de Jean Charles could be a test case, if we could learn from this. It was the first of many. But think about that, $48 million, 35 families. This is very expensive. I mean, they're actually finding that it isn't enough to cover all the costs, long preparatory process, finding the land, rebuilding, housing, transport, dealing with a lot of the legal and associated issues. The idea was that individuals would be given a house with the average value of $225,000 each family that moved was a forgivable mortgage. So this was intended so somebody wouldn't get a brand new house and then sell it the next week. It was intended for people to live in. So you had to live in it for 5 years and then your mortgage would be forgiven. It was also on the condition that no improvements would be made in the community of origin, in the original Ile de Jean Charles community. And people had very deep roots to this community, even though it had been battered by storms over the years. And indeed, it lost about 95% of its land area since 1950, and it lost probably 3/4 of its population as people felt like they really couldn't continue to keep their jobs without reliable transport, and they didn't have reliable transport because the roads were always flooded. So people had been migrating out of the area for a long time before the relocation took place. I mean, I serve as one of the academic advisors to this project, and I mean, it's turned out to be really complicated. There are different Indigenous groups on the island. There are questions about what about Indigenous members of the community who moved away 5 or 10 years beforehand. Should they be eligible for relocation assistance? Certainly a lot of the Indigenous leaders saw this an opportunity to recreate their Indigenous community. As I said, many of whom had moved away in a new and safe location. You know, the state of Louisiana had problems. You know, who are we responsible for? We're really trying to help the residents of the island move to someplace safer. That's our intention. And yet it became very complicated for cultural reasons that also apply in Alaska and other places. So it turned out to be complicated, turned out to be very expensive. One of the difficulties, you know, is this planned relocation is a last resort, and it was a last resort for this small community of Ile de Jean Charles. And yet, if you wait until it's really desperate, you know, all of the young, employed members of the community, people with families have moved on. You know, I think the average age of the inhabitants of Ile de Jean Charles when the relocation began was 67. You know, how do you recreate a dynamic community with, you know, mostly people who are older and less economically active? Maybe, you know, I say this with some degree of caution, but maybe it would have all gone smoother if it had happened 10 years ago, before so many people had left, before things were really desperate. Fine, this is a photo of Ile de Jean Charles after the hurricane last summer in August 2020. You can see the main road is completely submerged, and indeed many of the houses in the community, really showing that this community was facing recurrent flooding and hazards, and maybe planned relocation was the only way to go. There are a bunch of academics who are looking at the relocation. I'm sure we'll see some academic publications and surveys with what the residents think after all is said and done. But, you know, I think it illustrates that planned relocation, even if you've got great general guidelines, in practice is always complicated. So let me stop there and get back so I can see some faces here. And oh, got some things in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. And first, I would just like to invite everyone to give a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you, Beth, as always, for an amazing presentation and for pulling in your own experiences. We already have many questions. Susanna, I'm going to ask you to come on and ask yours first.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's right up my alley, so I'm really appreciative. And this is something which I've been giving quite a bit of thought in my life. So I'm very appreciative, and communities in which I've lived in the past that have been in active discussion about what to do when you can't make a living due to climate issues, and at what point do you leave. So really appreciative of this. And while I like your global perspective, I'm interested in looking, you know, in the Arctic specifically. What are some issues that, you know, you're talking about sort of a one size model doesn't fit everybody, and different places have different issues, multiple issues at times. What are some Arctic? So I've got a two-part question. One is what are some Arctic specific issues, and then the second one is looking at the U.S. And you mentioned that, you know, the U.S. not only doesn't have a policy, it's unclear where that policy would be based. And we have Obama back in 2016, who had his executive order about so the Bering Sea climate resilience, and Trump, who revoked that, and then Biden, who back in April put something else back in that still questions about what kind of teeth it has. Where does the U.S. go from here? So that's my second question. You know, how do we get that buy-in and direction when we haven't traditionally been supportive with policies, but we've also had this political seesaw. So thank you.
Yeah, there are a couple aspects to your question, starting with the Arctic first, and particularly Alaska. I think it's 31, maybe it's 33 indigenous communities have already decided they need to relocate. This has been affirmed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, by the state government. It is not a politically polarizing issue. People need to move. And that's because of melting permafrost, you know, communities that have lost their sewage systems because of melting permafrost, but also, you know, recurring storm surges and, you know, the issues you've been covering here, I'm sure in some depth. So there are communities that need to move, but the US government, and certainly not the Alaskan government, doesn't have the means of supporting them. To oversimplify, our disaster law called the Stafford Act of 1980 provides some support for people to rebuild after a disaster in the place where the disaster occurred. They can't take that money and rebuild elsewhere, even if it's safer. That's true in Houston, Texas, where a lot of people wanted to use their FEMA funds to rebuild on higher ground. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but that, you know, under US law isn't possible. So there are glaring weaknesses in US disaster law generally, but when it comes to planned relocation, there's no policy, there's no government agency charged with overseeing this or supporting this or working with indigenous or other local groups who need to move. The states seem to have been in the lead on most buyout programs. New Jersey's done a pretty good job with its Blue Acres program, but that's individuals, that's not relocating a community. Robin Bronin, I don't know if you've read anything by Robin, but she's probably written more about displacement in Alaska than anybody else, and has worked very closely with indigenous communities and worked with the Obama administration trying to get that 2016 order. So, you know, it's really kind of a mess. I don't see any initiative in the Biden administration to take this issue seriously. Now on February 4th, I think Biden issued an executive order that included asking interagency process to come up with a report on climate migration. But what Biden was thinking and what the US government folks are thinking is, how do we deal with people who arrive on US borders for climate-related reasons? And there's kind of a process to deal with that, which is complicated in its own right. But there was nothing about climate migration in the United States. And that's where most of the migration is going to happen, and everywhere. It's going to happen internally within the borders of a country. It's already happening in the United States. You know, there have been meetings on managed retreat, for example, by governors and mayors who have very different perspectives on what to do. You know, some really, my impression, burying their heads in the sand and saying, well, this isn't going to happen, at least not during my term of office, so I don't need to deal with it, while other governments are taking it very seriously. Place like Norfolk, Virginia, you know, the world's largest naval, the U.S. Navy is taking it very seriously. You know, what are we going to do? Because we see the handwriting on the wall. Climate change is going to make this port either inoperable or uninhabitable, and what do we do about it? Anyway, so some are taking it very seriously, and many aren't. So I don't know. I mean, I think that I don't know, I'm working with Task Force Advising on this executive order for climate migration, and I'm putting in a plea. Think about relocation of communities. What works? What should work? Who's in charge? What laws are there? How can you really diminish the need for planned relocation by taking other adaptation measures? So I really encourage you to do further work in this area, because we need a lot more thinking and a lot more research and a lot more case studies of what's worked, what hasn't worked, because it is going to be a bigger issue in the coming decades.
Can you, though, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, looking at Alaska, because with the communities that have identified that this is something that they need to do, and some of whom have already voted on it repeatedly. But am I mistaken to say when Trump put in his executive order that was supported by Sullivan, Young, and was that not supported by the Alaskan Murkowski, or like senators and governor, that we don't need this in Alaska? I thought there was something, and that's why I'm just looking at that. But
I'm sorry, I don't know much about the politics of a particular decision, but members of the representatives of Alaska in Congress, Republicans, have certainly supported changes to the Stafford Act to deal with the reality that it does not meet the needs of people in their region.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I would also echo Beth's call to do more work on this, especially as you're thinking about possible briefer topics or maybe collaborations with your fellow fellows and what you could do next. We have another question, and I'm going to ask Chloe if you would like to come on and ask it yourself.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Dr. Ferris, for a really insightful and somewhat, and I think it was Scout who commented, somewhat scary and terrifying topic. And so my question, I feel like you've maybe already answered the second part in a previous answer, but wondering about how you see balancing that, the fear that can occur versus being proactive. And then with that in mind, thinking about, is there a need for the Arctic Council to come together and begin looking at this more closely, and perhaps through the formation of a working group or similar task team that could help make that balance, negating the fear with being proactive and planning forward?
Yeah, you know, discussion of climate migration generally is pretty depressing. I mean, to think about people who are, nobody wants to leave, nobody wants to be forced to leave their home or wherever it is. And so, you know, anything, you know, I think a lot of climate activists hope that by making it terrifying, you'll take the necessary actions to prevent it from happening. You know, reduce greenhouse emissions now so we can stay where we are. So it is scary when you think about it. On the other hand, you know, people have always migrated on this planet. The whole planet was settled by people migrating in search of a better life or in response to environmental catastrophes, whether it was the Mayas or, you know, migration is natural. It's kind of a form of adaptation to the environment. So, I mean, I think the trick is to, you know, come up with ways to make migration better, a better adaptation tool to climate change, to see it as an opportunity while decreasing the forced nature of displacement. You know, so it's kind of a mixed bag there. And planned relocations, I think, will be a relatively small part of this migration and displacement relocations bit, at least for the next 10 or 15 years, and then it's bound to become more important. And yes, you know, I definitely think the Arctic Council needs to address this. You know, one of the problems is that, at least in the Arctic context, climate change has often been discussed in security terms. You know, as a security issue, and the Arctic Council stayed away from security issues. But this is an environmental issue, and it's also very much a human social protection type of issue. So, I mean, I think that there are ways the Arctic Council could address climate migration generally without getting too much into the security dimension of, you know, sea routes through the Arctic, and I don't know, it gets all very complicated. But yeah, I think it would be really good to, and particularly as it offers a forum for Indigenous voices to be a part of that discussion, to make sure that these decisions aren't just made by governments, particularly national governments, and that, you know, at least there's some consideration given to developing ways so that Indigenous people can take charge of their own lives.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Demetrius, do you want to come on and ask your question next?
Yes, thank you very much, first of all. And yeah, this is an issue that actually has like a lot of questions, that raises like so many questions. But yeah, I will try to keep it like to one or two for now. First of all, you mentioned like some costs in terms of financing for relocating these communities, but also from what I have understood with like a lot of these situations is that these communities and these people, they really, because they have built their economy there based on the resources, it's very difficult. This is like, I guess, the worst part, the most difficult one to let go. So it is like in these funds, basically, is like a stimulation package, or is it on, for example, is it up for discussion or research to have a stimulation package included in this, in the economy, in the form of anything? And if yes, what kind of discussion is it in that sense?
Yeah, thank you for raising that. It's really important, you know, the financing of it all and why it's so expensive. The biggest problem, as you mentioned, is livelihoods. When people are moved, particularly when they're moved to a place where they can't practice their traditional livelihoods, it's a huge issue. There have been cases, for example, after the tsunami in Sri Lanka, fisher folk were moved inland about 5 miles. They could no longer fish along the coast as they had. And most of them got jobs in a factory making batteries. Well, social scientists said, oh, isn't this terrible? They're much worse off. And yet when they went and talked to them, they were really happy. They were making a whole lot more money, and it was less risky than setting out in their boat. So I don't think we can, you know, say you have to recreate livelihoods exactly as they were, but you need to make sure that people, you know, find jobs that they are happy with, or they like, or they can support the family. Too often, frankly, government officials don't think about that. After Hurricane Mitch in Central America in 1998, USAID spent I don't know how many millions of dollars building these beautiful little villages with very nice little houses for people who before had very, very substandard housing. And so people moved into these houses, and within a year, they'd all moved away. They'd all moved to Tegucigalpa because there weren't any jobs there. There weren't any buses there. They couldn't survive, even if they had a nice little house. You know, so it isn't just about housing. And that's what most people think about with relocation is let's build new houses and build, you know, the houses in Ile Jean Charles are all, you know, powered by solar energy and beautifully laid out and take advantage of the environment. It meets the needs of the communities, but it's really not so much about the housing. It's about livelihoods and access to services and culture. You know, culture is a huge deal that, you know, again, particularly in Indigenous communities, but, you know, people, I remember talking with somebody in the Solomon Islands who said, yeah, my village was relocated. I'm safe. It's nice to have a new house. I've got a good job, or my husband does. But I go back to my community and my ancestors' graves are floating in water. You know, I just feel so sad that my people, my culture, my tradition, they're gone to me, even though I have a nice house. So it's, you know, it's a lot of different things that have to be back. You know, planned relocations is kind of like social engineering. And sometimes even if they have the best of intention, the engineers don't think of everything. They don't think about the graves back home, or, you know, one example in Africa, people were moved away from the coast and they were much safer. But particularly the older members of the community said, the thing I miss most is not being able to drink my morning tea and see the ocean. I can't do that anymore. This was a World Bank funded project, and bless their hearts, they went in and they changed the physical design so that everybody could drink their tea in the morning and see the ocean. You know, but if they'd asked first, maybe they would have had a little different design. So different factors are important to different communities.
As you said, it's definitely an issue of like well thought policies, and not only on the job market, but of course also on the mental situation, because it's a very difficult process for each person to relocate. So yeah, we have to think of their mental health as well. And I have like one more question on that, because I mean, it's like, for example, climate change is not like any other disaster. So it's not that, for example, a disaster happens and you have to relocate. It's the temperature increase, for example, the melting of permafrost. And are there some indicators, for example, when like making maybe like a simulation, or like to see like when this policy will be implemented, the relocation policy? Is there like an indicator, for example, a specific increase, like a threshold, like a specific increase of the temperature, or I don't know, a specific increase of sea level rise, apart, like after which these relocation policies are implemented, or what are the criteria?
Yeah, there is no generally accepted threshold, but a lot of people are working on that. They're saying, for our community, what will the tipping point be? How many floods in a season? How many recurrent? I mean, is it after 3 hurricanes or after 20 hurricanes that we all have to move? You know, I think having those discussions is really useful for communities, and to get the communities involved too. When do we? How hot does it have to get? How long does the drought have to last? You know, to gain support for that decision. On your first point, back in the 1800s or 1900s, there were 2 cases where whole communities, whole islands in the Pacific were relocated by the British. They were moved from one island to another for environmental reasons or economic reasons. And Jane McAdam has written about this. And in one of the communities, people integrated into their new community. They felt like they were part of the community. They revered the old land, but they were basically content. The other community, they resented it. You know, 100 years after the move, they still felt resentment that something had been taken from them. And the difference between those 2 communities is, in the first one, the group themselves decided, we have got to move, and asked the British to move them. You know, and therefore there was a big factor, I think, in their becoming content. The other community had no advance warning. The British just showed up on their shores and said, you're all moving today. You know, we're piling you on a boat. This is for your own good. We're taking care of you. But the resentment 100 years later is still apparent. That's why that whole issue of participation isn't just something nice to do. It's really essential to the success of any of these efforts.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question from Griffith, who asks, I wonder if you could briefly speak on the debate about responsibility for climate mitigation and adaptation. Is there any discussion about responsible parties for climate change and obligations to help communities now forced to relocate? Is there a sense that liability for costs should lie between the local or federal government?
Oh, well, there's several questions in there. This is probably the hottest issue right now in the whole climate change debate structure, is who is responsible for the effects of climate change? Is it those who are emitting the most carbon, such as the United States historically, or now, such as China and India? Or is it, can you even assign that responsibility? This has become a North-South issue, with governments in the global South saying, hey, you know, you rich countries have, you know, created this situation in part to fuel your own industrial growth. Now, one, you're telling us not to do the same thing, although we also have aspirations for everyone in our country to have electricity. You know, how can you blame us for contributing to climate change when look what you did? And then secondly, what about the costs, including the costs of migration? You know, in its most extreme form, you hear people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu saying, you rich countries have created climate change, therefore there are going to be 1 million people showing up on your borders, and you have a responsibility to take them because your actions have destroyed or at least harmed the environment in which they're living. So, you know, sometimes it's phrased in stark terms like that. Usually it's put more diplomatically in UN terminology of loss and damage, who's responsible for loss and damage, and let's set up a fund to mitigate the worst of this. You know, so it's a hot political issue. It isn't resolved. It gets very ugly when you're talking about migrants. You know, I happen to think that, you know, migrants are really contribute to a country's economy and society. And, you know, so sometimes it's, you know, you're seeing migrants as a burden, as a cost, as a, you know, it's a very negative thing is really hard to take. But anyway, so, you know, looking at, you know, who is responsible for this, I can tell you, having worked a lot in the Pacific Islands, I mean, it's heartbreaking to talk to people who see their habitat being destroyed. when their contribution to global emissions, is less than 0.1% or something like that, they haven't created the problem, but they're the ones that are experiencing it. They're the ones that are seeing the sea level rise, and you can actually see the difference from year to year when you go to some of these islands. That last time I was here, the beach was much bigger. It's real. It's perceived as an existential threat, and this feeling like we are completely at the mercy of large industrial countries who aren't thinking about us when they make their development plans and decide what targets they can or cannot meet with respect to climate change agreements. So, I think it really is a justice issue and an intergenerational issue. It's young people who are going to be facing the consequences, and it's mainly old people who are making the decisions.
And I might ask one follow-up before getting to our final question in the hour. If you could talk a bit maybe about how Griffith's question intersects with loss and damage, and if there's been, in international conversations, there has been, as you say, hot debate on responsibility for decades, which I think ultimately has led us to where we are now and how we are and are not addressing loss and damage, and what it means to have funding or not have funding for the devastation you're talking about. And I know you're, deeply involved in those discussions. And I wonder if you can talk, we haven't yet addressed loss and damage in a real way. We briefly mentioned it in our cultural heritage talk by Emily a couple of weeks ago, but maybe if you can bring that perspective to the participants, they might enjoy that too.
Sure. Well, the UNFCCC has set up something called the, anyway, make a long story short, there's a task force on displacement that's part of the Warsaw Loss and Damage Mechanism that's considering the way in which migration and displacement should figure into discussions about loss and damage and compensation and reparations and so forth. What they seem to be coming up with, and you can understand that politically this is more palatable, is to say, let's set up funds. And we won't admit any responsibility for this, but we'll contribute money to help countries that are experiencing the negative effects of climate change. It's kind of a way of depoliticizing it. I don't see, a well-tried assumption in environmental laws, polluter pays. The polluter should pay the costs of the damages. It's been very difficult to get that translated into the climate change framework. Rich countries, polluter countries, emitting countries have been reluctant to take on that responsibility. So I think probably what's going to happen is to have more money for these funds, maybe more help with these funds. Most of the adaptation funds and mitigation funds now are for things like building seawalls and dikes. There's very little money going into planning for migration, even though that's going to be one of the major effects of climate change. Give some funds to governments to put together plans to assess what's needed. A friend of mine was working with the Jamaican government from the World Bank, which did an assessment of communities that might need to be relocated because of the effect of climate change. So they did a very careful analysis, and they identified over 1,000 communities that were likely to need to be relocated within the next decade. The response of the Jamaican government was, we can't begin to handle moving 1,000 communities. We simply won't do anything and leave it to the next government. It was overwhelming to try to deal with that. So sometimes, science, even good science, can, not be helpful in producing good policy outcomes when it seems like it's overwhelming. I hope you aren't overwhelmed.
Yeah. No, they just have all of this knowledge from 6 weeks of these sessions. So now they should feel empowered. We have one final question to round us out from Zhenming, who wants to thank you for this amazing presentation and wants to know what you think the most important factors should be taking into consideration when making immigration policy. You already mentioned price, so what else is important?
For immigration policy generally, it's a fundamental of international law. Every government has the right to determine who can enter their country. I mean, you may not like it and it was politically unfeasible, but President Biden has the right basically to say only Norwegians with engineering PhDs and blue eyes are allowed to enter the country. I mean, a government has the right to determine who can enter their country. So on general immigration, usually it's a mixture of family reunification to allow parents to bring their children or husbands to bring wives, et cetera, and employment. What we need in our economy is software engineers and landscapers. So therefore, we will set up categories for those particular groups of immigrants that can help our economy. So, you know, every country does that differently. The US basic immigration system is 2/3 family, 1/3 workers. Australia, it's 2/3 workers, 1/3 family. So governments, you know, make those decisions differently. That's on the economic immigration side. You know, while governments have the right to determine who enters their country, there is one exception. Governments that have signed the Refugee Convention promise that those people who come and say, don't send me back because I fear for my life, they should be allowed to enter and to make a claim for asylum. You don't have to promise that they'll be allowed to stay forever, but you have to allow them to enter the country. That's the one way in which governments have given up a little bit of their sovereignty to protect people fleeing, usually violence and persecution, have a priori claim, quite apart from family and work and other issues. So, you know, those are the basic components of immigration policy. The US, you know, until Trump had a long tradition of being welcoming to both immigrants and refugees, asylum seekers. You know, in the United States, everybody in the United States is either an indigenous person, a former slave, former immigrant, or a refugee. You know, so we've got this long tradition of welcoming, or at least allowing people to stay in the country from other parts of the world. Other countries don't have those traditions. You know, other countries don't have that same sense of we are a nation of immigrants, so their policies are different. So there are a lot of things that go into immigration policy. And finally, just to say that the role of diaspora groups is really important. So Vietnamese Americans or Somali Americans or Cuban Americans can often effectively lobby to allow more people from their countries of origin to come.
Thank you. And I see we are just at our hour now. So I'm going to again ask everyone to join me in giving a thunderous round of applause. I know you can't hear it, Beth, but I can guarantee you that it is being heard around the world from all of our participants today. Thank you so much, Beth, for taking time out of your summer to share your experience and expertise. I'm sure you will have many questions coming your way as people pursue further research on this.
And please look into it and do research on it. I'm always happy to answer questions by email or Zoom. Victoria has my email. Anyway, see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Beth. So this concludes our